It might be hard to believe, but the century is already a quarter way done as we gear up for the 2025 season. Who have been the best of the best for the Seahawks over the last 25 years? I'm going to be dishing out my all-quarter century team here on our Saturday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks to all the 12s tuning in on this Saturday afternoon, whether you're in Auburn, Washington, or Auburn, Indiana. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for tuning in. And making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. As we draw closer to the start of the 2025 season, this certainly makes me feel old. We are now a quarter way through the 21st century, which means it's time to dish out our all-quarter century team. I'm going to be looking at offensive skill players, defensive skill players, and, of course, the trench play, offensive, defensive line, a 53-man roster. We've got specialists as well. Jam-packed episode, so let's get to it. As far as any guidelines for this all-quarter century Seahawks squad, generally, players had to be on the Seahawks at least 3 seasons during this century. There's one exception to that rule, being a player that's been in the league for 2 years and has had 2 Pro Bowls and deserves to be on this roster. But for the most part, I adhered to that. Looking for Pro Bowls, all pros. There are some guys that don't have those that were incredibly valuable to the Seahawks, though. So I'm looking forward to diving into this. So let's get started with offensive skill positions, the all-quarter century team for the Seattle Seahawks, 2000 to 2024. And we'll start in the backfield at the quarterback position. And look, I know that Russell Wilson's tenure in Seattle did not end on good terms, forcing his way out of town, getting traded to the Denver Broncos. Now he's bounced around with a couple other different teams, but he's a 10-time Pro Bowler, and he has been a second-team All-Pro. He is the leader in every significant statistic passing-wise for the Seahawks. He is the best quarterback in franchise history. So, of course, he's going to be on this roster. And then behind him, Matt Hasselbeck doesn't have near as many Pro Bowls. He didn't have an All-Pro selection, but he still was a 3-time Pro Bowler as Seahawks starting quarterback, led the team to their first Super Bowl in franchise history until Russell Wilson came around, held several of Seattle's passing records as well, a bunch of playoff appearances as the quarterback of the Seahawks. So those two make the roster. Geno Smith was considered for this because he's had 2 Pro Bowls, but just a 3-year starter. I felt like there were too many good players at other positions. Russell Wilson, Matt Hasselbeck being the 2 quarterbacks for the Seahawks in the all-quarter century team. As far as the running back position, I kept 4 on the roster. You can debate whether Marshawn Lynch or Sean Alexander should be the starter. I think it is much closer than some fans believe. There's a lot of fans that think beast mode should be the guy. Sean Alexander, I think that's discounting what he was able to accomplish when he was in his prime as well. And Chris Carson, I know injuries ended up wreaking havoc on his career, and he had it shortened by the neck injury, missed a lot of time in the league, but he had a couple 1,000-yard seasons. He was a punishing runner, a good pass catcher out of the backfield. So he's my running back 3 for this quarter century team. I thought about Ricky Watters, but decided to go with Chris Carson here. And then at the special teams position, and also being a running back, one of the best kick and punt returners in franchise history, Leon Washington is that third down option in your offense that had some decent rushing success when he has opportunities. But his asset to this team is going to be returning kicks and punts, where he was absolutely dynamic during his time with the Seattle Seahawks. Going to the outside at the receiver position for the all-century team, I ended up keeping 6 players in the receiving core. Tyler Lockett being the leader of the clubhouse in terms of receptions, receiving yards, touchdowns. I think you can make an argument that Doug Baldwin was just as good, maybe a better player. His career was shortened by injuries that forced him to retire after the 2018 season. But both Lockett and Baldwin, fantastic route runners. They were able to consistently catch the football and make big plays for the Seahawks. Spent a long time with the Seahawks as well. Bobby Engram was the guy that broke the 1,000-yard drought for the Seahawks at receiver. Darrell Jackson had several big seasons in the early 2000s, catching passes from Matt Hasselbeck, and had a really rock-solid career. DK Metcalf, now a player that a lot of fans are upset at for requesting a trade, gets sent to the Pittsburgh Steelers, but you can't deny the productivity during his time in Seattle, and he was a second-team All-Pro. He had a season with over 1,300 receiving yards where he broke Steve Largent's single-season record, scored a lot of touchdowns, had a lot of big explosive plays in his time in Seattle. So you have to have DK Metcalf on this roster. And Jermaine Kearse, the stats are not as gaudy as the other 5 players that made this team, but Jermaine Kearse was a guy that played some special teams early in his career, and we know just how incredible he was in crucial clutch situations and the big plays that he came up with, winning the NFC Championship game over the Packers with that overtime catch. The remarkable catch that he kicked off of his shoe that he ended up catching, almost leading to a victory over the Patriots in the Super Bowl. We won't talk about what happened after that play, but Jermaine Kearse had a really good career for an undrafted player. Similar trajectory to Doug Baldwin. Didn't have the 1,000-yard seasons, but he was still productive. He scored touchdowns, and he came through in the clutch. Really good clubhouse guy. I think is a 6th receiver on this all-quarter century team. He absolutely is the most deserving if you're going to keep 6 receivers on this roster. And let's talk tight ends and fullbacks. At the tight end position, and it was pretty obvious about this when you consider that the Seahawks top 50 team did not have a single tight end on it. That doesn't mean, though, there haven't been good tight ends on this roster in the last 24 years. To me, Zach Miller, the all-around tight end that he was, and just how important he was blocking in front of Marshawn Lynch, that is the player that I think has to be your tight end number 1. Jimmy Graham, he was a public enemy because didn't necessarily fit what the Seahawks needed to do on offense. He traded away an all-pro center to bring him in, but he still had a couple 1,000-yard seasons. He had a 10-touchdown season. Jimmy Graham is a really good receiving tight end that I think did more than what fans are willing to acknowledge during his time in Seattle. And John Carlson, we're talking about a guy that injuries ended up cutting his career a little bit short. He also had less than stellar quarterback play at times during his time in Seattle. I thought Carlson was an underrated pass-catching tight end during his time with the Seahawks, and wish his career could have been a little bit more productive with less injuries, the concussion issues that he dealt with. But to me, is a really rock-solid tight end 3 on this roster. And, of course, you got to have a fullback. Max Strong, to me, the best fullback in franchise history in terms of traditional fullback. John L. Williams, you can make arguments about as well, but John L. Williams played in the 80s and 90s, so he is not even eligible for this team. Max Strong getting the nod here, going to be lead blocking for Marshawn Lynch, Sean Alexander, and company. Also occasionally could run the football, could catch the ball out of the backfield. Hard-nosed blocker, though. That's what he really brings to the table. So you have 3 tight ends and a fullback on the roster. I like the fact that we've got the special teams kind of covered here already with players like Leon Washington in the kick punt return game. Like I said, Jermaine Kearse played some special teams. Tyler Lockett was an elite kick punt returner early in his career. So you've got a lot of juice to use on the third phase of the game as well. You have the ability to play a lot of different personnel groupings with Max Strong, with the tight ends that the Seahawks have. So I think this is a really fun offensive skill unit. If you were putting them up against other teams across the league in the last 24 years, I would feel pretty confident that the Seahawks would be an upper echelon team in terms of talent. But I think you can make an even bigger argument that the defensive skill positions would stack up even more favorably against the rest of the league. And I'm going to get to those coming up next year on our Saturday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Guys, you've probably heard of Viagra or Cialis. Maybe you've even tried them. But if you're looking for something beyond the usual pill, it's time to meet the Rougiette Ready. Rougiette Ready is a next-gen prescription treatment designed to amplify arousal in the brain and boost blood flow. Unlike the usual pills that can take hours, Rougiette's 3-in-1 formula dissolves under your tongue and it kicks in fast. On average, in 15 minutes, effects can last up to 36 hours, so you can stay confident and in control when the moment is right. If traditional options haven't worked, Rougiette might be the answer. Over 150,000 men have already made the switch. You can even read real customer reviews on their site. It's helping a lot of people feel more confident and present in the moment. Head to Rougiette.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code LockedOnNFL to get 15% off today. That's Rougiette, RUGIET.com/LockedOnNFL, and use the promo code LockedOnNFL for 15% off. Individual results may vary with prescription treatment. Compounded drugs are permitted to be prescribed under federal law, but are not FDA approved and do not undergo FDA safety, effectiveness, or manufacturing review. Please visit the Rougiette website for full safety information. Welcome back to the Saturday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. All right, let's jump into the defensive skill positions for the Seattle Seahawks on the All-Century team, the All-Quarter Century team. Just looked at offensive skill positions, and there's a number of really intriguing players that are going to be making this side of the football to go with the big-name stars. Let's start the festivities here at linebacker. I decided to keep 5 linebackers on the roster for this All-Quarter Century squad. This is an outstanding group when you consider that Bobby Wagner, KJ Wright, both were outstanding players that were centerpieces in that squad, the Legion of Boom, that helped the Seahawks make a couple of Super Bowls in a row. Lofa Tatupu helped the team get to their first Super Bowl as a rookie back in 2005. And behind those two, of course, you've got Julian Peterson and Malcolm Smith, and 2 players that are on this roster for different reasons. Julian Peterson came over from San Francisco, the bitter rivals, played 3 seasons in Seattle, but he was a Pro Bowler all 3 of those years. Very effective blitzer that you could use off the edge, that created havoc in the backfield. Very productive in those 3 seasons. He's going to bring a different element than the other 3 linebackers that are ahead of him here on the depth chart. And Malcolm Smith is the special teams anchor, a guy that you can plug into the defensive lineup and can come through with big plays, as we saw in that blowout Super Bowl win over the Denver Broncos. So Malcolm Smith getting a spot on this roster as well. At the cornerback position in the secondary, everybody knows who's going to be number 1 on the depth chart here. Richard Sherman coming in as one of the best corners of his era. Marcus Trufant, I think, got overlooked for what he accomplished during his time in Seattle, but he was a Pro Bowl corner, a key cog on that defense that helped the Seahawks finally get over the hump and get to the Super Bowl back in 2005. And he was that veteran that guys like Richard Sherman leaned on at the very end of his career. He was still on the roster for the Seahawks. So Trufant was an invaluable member of not just what the Seahawks did in the 2000s, but also passing the torch to players like Richard Sherman. Sean Springs only played a few years in Seattle in the 2000s, but was still a starter, was still effective. I think you got to have him on this football team. He did have a 3-interception season for the Seahawks after the turn of the century, and he was one of the better defensive players, even if he didn't reach the levels he had in his first couple years with the team in the late 90s. He was still a productive, effective boundary corner and a guy that you could move inside if you needed to. Behind those 3, Reek Woolen and Devin Witherspoon on the current iteration of the Seahawks. I have to include both these guys on the roster. Reek Woolen has been a Pro Bowler. He was a Defensive Rookie of the Year finalist, led all corners and interceptions his rookie year. And I know his performance has not been at that level the last 2 years. There's been a lot more inconsistency, but he still has more career interceptions than what Brandon Browner did in Seattle in his 3 years in a Seahawks uniform. He's been a Pro Bowl talent. And this is a guy that's done a lot of really good things for the Seahawks. And he gives a different element compared to the corners that Seattle has on this roster with his sub 4.3 speed. Devin Witherspoon's only been in the franchise for 2 years, but he's been a Pro Bowler both years. And he's a different skill set. You can put him in the slot and blitz. Incredibly effective getting after the quarterback. Going to rack up a lot of tackles. He's a very physical player. He's going to complement the other guys that are in this cornerback group. And even after 2 seasons, I think you can make a really compelling argument that he is one of the 5 best corners the Seahawks have had during this century to this point. And I kept Byron Maxwell as corner number 6. Doesn't have the interception numbers, never was a Pro Bowler, but you saw the peanut punch with him. This is a guy that knew how to create fumbles. He was an effective special teams player early in his career that transformed into a critical member of that defense that got to the Super Bowl multiple seasons in a row, came back in 2017 and gave them some solid snaps. To me, as a sixth corner, Byron Maxwell is a really fun addition to this roster and was deserving to be here over anyone else that would have potentially been in the mix for a roster spot. As for the safety spot, the first three are really easy. Obviously, you're going to have Earl Thomas, Cam Chancellor, perennial All-Pro, Pro Bowl talents, guys that were really trendsetters at the position with Earl Thomas and his ball hawking skills and just how much area he could cover and take away from opposing passing games. There just aren't very many safeties that have that kind of ability. He also brought the hard hitting element. And Cam Chancellor, he was one of one with how he was able to blow up offensive linemen, knock them on their duff, his physicality, his size, the enforcer mentality. You didn't want to run across the middle of the field. A lot of different receivers learned that lesson the hard way against Cam Chancellor. Those two guys, that's really easy selections. A lot of Seattle's other elite safeties played prior to the 2000s. But Quandre Diggs in his time in Seattle, he spent 4 seasons with the team, 4.5 seasons. He was a Pro Bowler 3 times. He racked up really good interception numbers during that time as well. He was one of the most prolific ball hawking safeties in the league during his time with the Seahawks. Not going to beat out Earl Thomas for a starting job, but if Mike McDonald is the coach of this team and he wants to play 3 safety sets, you could have a lot of fun plugging Quandre Diggs in, a guy that also played some slot corner early in his career, played on the outside a little bit as well in college at Texas. So you've got some positional versatility there and the ball skills. He's got to be on this roster. And I'm going to add Reggie Tongue. This might not be a name that a lot of Seahawk fans are familiar with because he played on this team from 2000 to 2003. But Reggie Tongue gave the Seahawks a really solid all-around skill set. He was a guy that could play in the box. He could hit. He had good interception numbers during his 4 years with the franchise. And the defense had their struggles during that time, but I always felt like Reggie Tongue was kind of one of those glue guys that made it. They were able to get over the hump, get into the playoffs after some underachieving seasons. He was a guy that consistently brought his game, and he had that all-around safety skill set that you're looking for. He contributed on special teams. I think he'd be a really good fourth safety to have on this squad. Real quick, let's talk specialists. I already mentioned Leon Washington, Tyler Lockett. They're on the roster listed as offensive players. Those are going to be your kick and punt return specialists. I'm keeping, just as the top 50 team for the Seahawks did, I'm keeping 2 punters on this roster. John Ryan's going to be my emergency quarterback number 3. I mean, we saw that touchdown pass to Gary Gilliam in the NFC Championship game against the Packers that got that massive comeback rolling. So John Ryan, second punter, maybe he and Dixon can alternate as a holder. Stephen Hauschka beating out, in my opinion, Jason Myers for the kicker position. I think Jason Myers has had some really good seasons. Hauschka, though, was just so incredibly consistent, and he was clutch in postseason games. Dixon has been the better punter statistically and had an all-pro early in his career, so I've got him with the edge. But John Ryan's got to be on this roster as one of the more popular players in Seahawks history. So let's get him on the roster. Let's have 2 punters. I think that's the way that this is going to end up working out for the Seahawks on this roster. Let's really double down on that. And as for who's going to be doing the long snapping, well, that's going to be pretty easy because long snappers, you can get one of the offensive linemen I'm going to be talking about here and plug them in on this roster. When I come back, we've got the trenches to cover, offensive line, defensive line. We'll get to that up next here on our Saturday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends or family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize you want to be in the stands. That's exactly where Game Time comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last-minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, or even invite a bigger group to come with you. Game Time makes it possible. Game Time makes buying tickets fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to the first pitch, and they've got incredible last-minute deals. clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worrying out of buying. Game Time is the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB, and that makes it even easier to browse the app for an exciting upcoming game between the Blue Jays and the Red Sox. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, creating an account, and using the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Saturday edition. This is your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. Going to transition here on our all-quarter century team to the trenches, defensive line and offensive line, the most important players on the football field. Let's get started with the defensive line, the defensive end group. Michael Bennett, Cliff Averill, Chris Clemens, the trio that was at the center of Seattle's pass rush during the height of the Legion of Boom. You got to include all three of those players. To me, Bennett being number one on the list just because of his dominant all-around skill set. Get in the backfield as a penetrator, rush the passer, really dominant in the run game. You could move him up and down the line. Cliff Averill gave you that slippery edge that could get upfield, round around tackles, lower his shoulder, dip around, and flatten his pass rushing route to get after the quarterback. And Chris Clemens was just electric. 3 straight years of 10-plus sacks. Those three guys have to make this roster. Behind them, Patrick Kearney had a short but very successful stint in Seattle. He was actually an all-pro selection that racked up more than 10 sacks in one of the seasons with Seattle. And he brought a different element. He was a true bully off the edge that could bulldoze tackles and get him into the backfield. And the two other players that I've got on this roster for the Seahawks, twitchy guys that I could plug in as rotational rushers, Frank Clark as well as Bruce Irvin. Irvin being a first rounder, Clark a second round pick that ended up getting 13.5 sacks in his last year in Seattle, developed into a really good pass rusher in Pete Carroll's defense. So that is a 6-pack that would cause a lot of problems for opposing offensive lines. As for the meat of the defensive line, Brandon Mebane, Jaron Reed, Rocky Bernard, to me, one of the underrated players from the 2005 Super Bowl team. And John Randall is also on this list. So we've got 3 Hall of Famers. I know Randall did most of his damage in Minnesota, but John Randall was a guy that had double-digit sacks his first year in Seattle. He made a Pro Bowl, and he was productive even the last 2 seasons, even if they weren't the numbers he was accustomed to putting up earlier in his career. Still was really good, had a Pro Bowl, and having him as your 4th defensive tackle, that's a pretty darn good lineup and rotation you've got in the interior defensive line. And to cap off this roster, we got to start or finish off with the most important position group on the entire team. Seahawks fans have unfortunately seen what can happen when you don't have a good offensive line. And I ended up keeping 9 players on this roster. At the tackle position, Big Walter Jones, to me, top 3 left tackle in NFL history. Easily is going to be on this roster, and a good chunk of his career came in the 2000s. He was an all-decade player, perennial all-pro. This is a really easy selection with him. And at the other tackle spot, the Seahawks have not had a right tackle that I felt like was deserving of this over Dwayne Brown or Russell Okung. And I know Okung had injuries that set him back quite a bit during his time, but he still had a Pro Bowl, still competed in 2 Super Bowls. Dwayne Brown was an All-Pro twice for the Seahawks. Those are the 2 other tackles that, to me, warranted an inclusion in this roster, and I think would have more than enough flexibility in this situation, this scenario, to move over to right tackle and have one of those guys. I would probably lean towards Dwayne Brown starting, but have him at one tackle spot. Walter Jones obviously holding down the blind side protector role. At the guard position, another Hall of Famer, Steve Hutchinson. Forget about the poison pill incident. This is still a guy who is an outstanding player that had dominant years in Seattle, and he's back as a scout and advisor for the offensive line. So let's forget about the poison pill. The guy was absolutely dominant during his time in Seattle. That left side of the line opening up holes for Sean Alexander. Chris Gray was the other guard on that Super Bowl team that was blocking in front of Sean Alexander, also a really good player that kind of hovered under the radar because of the star power that Seattle had with Walt Jones and Steve Hutchinson. Gray would be the other starter in this roster. And J.R. Sweezy, say what you want about him. He was never a Pro Bowler, but he started a lot of games as a converted defensive tackle, came back to Seattle, helped him get to the playoffs in 2018 in his second stint with the team. He was rock solid, not a star, not a Pro Bowler, but just rock solid. He played some snaps at both guard spots. To me, he is the perfect swing guard to have behind Chris Gray and Steve Hutchinson. And I'm keeping 3 centers on this roster. Max Unger, clearly the best center in franchise history, the only one that's been a first-team All-Pro. Robbie Tobeck was a Pro Bowler, an outstanding anchor in the middle for that offensive line in the mid-2000s, and that gives you one heck of a backup. And I'm keeping Justin Britt on this roster because Britt started a lot of games at center in his career, but before that, he started at tackle, he started at guard. Every offensive line needs that guy that's interflexible, that you can play at multiple positions. Justin Britt could play all across the offensive line, so it gives you a really good third center, a swing guard, a guy that could even play tackle in a pinch if you needed it with only 3 tackles on the roster. He's that all-encompassing player that every offensive line needs to have, regardless of what level you're at, but particularly in the NFL. As always, you can follow me on X and Blue Sky at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube, wherever you get your podcast, to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back on Monday, going to have some really good fun diving into the linebacker position in our position-by-position review. And we've got our next cluster of players in our 90-man rundown. We're going to start diving into some familiar names that have played a lot of snaps for the Seahawks over the past couple of years. Make sure that you listen in and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Go Hawks.